Ever get that little ditty in the back of your skull saying, "Hey, that's a great idea. I'm surprised no one's thought of it yet." No? Just me? Oh well. Today I wanted to try something new, something interesting. So I asked around and gathered a few different concept ideas from different people in both my community and Discord servers, and figured I would share them with you. So I gathered 5 different Genshin Impact original character ideas. Welcome guys, I'm your humble host Leon Strio, but most just call me Leon. So here's how this is gonna work. I'm gonna present each character individually and read off everything about them and try to bring them into alignment of the game to the point that we could potentially see them as playable characters. I'll try to keep them as close to their original ideas. For the sake of time, if they have constellations, I will not read them all, and instead we'll leave them in a Google Doc that will be linked in the description to view the characters in their entirety. Should I not have 5 different characters, I'll substitute one of them with one of my own and follow the same principles. So without further ado, let's get into it. Our first character comes from Aeternum. Aeternum pitched the idea of an animal swordsman by the name of Solus. One thing that stood out to me about him right out of the gate was the fact that he had made him an event-exclusive character, meaning that you would have to play this event and do the requirements in order to get him, and there was no other way of obtaining him. His talents for his basic attack was Gentle Breeze and Razor Tempest. Solus attacks with the blunt side of his sword, dealing almost no damage. His charge attacks are normally disabled. His elemental skill, Clashing Steel, Judgment Press. Solus enters a defensive stance for 1 second to parry a single instance of damage. If parry is successful, he gains 1 stack of Tempest, and the skill is immediately refreshed. If the parry is not successful, the skill enters a 6-second cooldown and loses 1 stack, a maximum of 3 stacks. Stacks can last for 300 seconds after obtaining. If you hold his elemental skill, Solus enters an offensive stance, dealing anemo damage in a small area around him. It amplifies his basic attacks with anemo damage and is amplified depending on how many stacks he has for 9 seconds. His elemental burst, Zephyrin Skyrise / Starfall. Solus lifts everyone around him into the air. Lighter enemies become helpless, while heavier enemies have their anemo resistance reduced by 40%. This lasts for 6 seconds. If Judgment status is active when this burst is activated, Judgment's duration is refreshed. You cannot swap into other characters during the duration. Co-op party members are in stasis during this duration. After the duration ends, the percentage of all the damage dealt in the last 6 seconds will be shared among all enemies hit in the initial cast. Solus's passive talents, Way of the Winds. Solus's critical stats are cut in half, but he gains double elemental mastery. His combat talent, Zephyrin Art, Forceful Karma. Every successful parry now deals 50% of Judgment's activation damage to the attacker. His second talent, Siphonic Art, Light Reave. Successful parries now heal you for 5% of your max HP, and consecutive parries heal for an additional 2.5% more for a maximum of 10%. Failing a parry resets this bonus. Now I won't lie, out of the gate I was hella confused as to how this character would work. If they did no damage from basic attacks and can't charge attack, that only left plunging attacks, which made me think, are they building a Zhao that only focuses on being in the air? I looked further into the kit and saw the burst and thought, yep, that sounds about right. But I knew there had to be something I was missing. I reached out to them to get a clearer idea of what they were going for, and he told me to revisit his elemental skill. That's when I noticed he's a very defensive character. His elemental skill has 2 effects. The first one counters and gives him a stack of Tempest that caps out at 3 and lasts for 300 seconds. Meanwhile, if you hold it, kind of like Bennett's skill that has 2 modes, you actually switch from defense to offense and consume those stacks, and that's where this character comes to life. Those stacks of Tempest are everything, and that's what gives you your damage. The fact that burst whisks enemies into the air and being helpless makes for a great crowd control and easy, uninterrupted swirl reactions, especially against enemies that like to swarm like hilly churls and mirror maiden spawns. I do think he needs a bit of love, even though he's a lot like Beto. I would say when you do his held elemental skill, 9 seconds seems rather short for the amount of time you have to stay in his passive state. So I would say it wouldn't be wrong to bump that time frame up to 15 seconds. That way there's a bit more room for error and allows for more swirl reactions. His burst while taking enemies out of combat is extremely powerful for crowd control. It's also a hindrance for his party members. During solo play, being locked out from switching I can understand, as that's essentially trading enemies out of combat for you being unable to switch. However, in co-op, taking your allies out of the fight is never fun for them, or in general for that matter. I would say I could just drop the allies can't do anything part for co-op and it would be fine. This allows solos to essentially be a tank and control the field while your allies do the damage and keep you alive while this ability is going, since you would be helpless otherwise. Overall, this sounds like a very interesting and fun playstyle, especially for Animal, usually being in this supportive role. Giving them a tank that can on a dime switch to a really solid sustaining DPS makes for a unique gameplay. Up next is a character by Sugar Rose, and Rose presented the idea of an Animal Catalyst user by the name of Alvaria. Her normal attack, Windy Swirl, Alvaria can send 5 consecutive normal attacks doing animal damage. Doing a charged attack consumes a set amount of stamina and to unleash double the amount of damage that normal attacks do. Her plunge attack allows her to dive mid-air and strike the ground, dealing AoE animal damage to nearby enemies around her. Her elemental skill, Attack from the Forest, sucks in nearby enemies and deals animal damage to enemies while doing so. While enemies are being sucked in, you can still attack them, allowing you to do more damage and opens the door for swirl reactions. Her elemental burst, Swirling Leaves, deals big AoE animal damage and puts a mark on the enemy that will constantly deal damage to them. Her passive talent, Nature's Way, all creatures that don't attack will not get scared when near. Her Ascension talent, Daylight's Wind, when casting her elemental skill, Attack from the Forest, she will give your team about 950 to 2500 attack, which is about a 25% damage increase. Her passive talent, I Won't Give Up, if Alvaria is on the battlefield, she gives the party members 15% crit rate and 25% crit damage. Now, I don't know about everyone else, but I love Catalyst characters. Kokomi, Yanfei, Sucrose, Mona, the list goes on. Alvaria being an animal catalyst already has me excited and really interested in how she would work. I could see her normal attacks allowing quick, easy swirls, especially with her charged attack doing double damage if you have a constant source of elemental power from another character. Bennett's ultimate, Radiant's elemental skills, Xingqiu's rain swords. This opens up the door for Alvaria to be a really solid sub-DPS character and can substitute as crowd control with her elemental skill, keeping enemies clumped together, and if you use her elemental burst right afterwards, the group of enemies are now all taking animal damage at all times until the mark goes away. Not to mention the swirl damage during the duration of her elemental burst. Overall, she's a pretty balanced character. The one thing that glared out to me was there was no real indicator of how long this mark was going to last. So we'll say the following. Alvaria gathers the air around her enemies and encases them in a vortex of animal energy, dealing AoE animal damage. Enemies caught within the vortex are given the mark of the Swirling Winds. Enemies with this mark take constant animal damage for 12 seconds. If you were to build this character with Elemental Mastery and Recharge Your Mind as your primary and secondary focuses, even if you only used her as crowd control, the swirl reaction generated from her would give her near permanent uptime on her elemental burst. Moving on, we have a Pyro Swordsman from Connor Cochino. I wasn't given too much to work with, so I'm going to freestyle this one a little bit. We'll call him Ming. Ming comes from Inazuma. His constellation is a fire-breathing dragon. His normal attack combos up to 5 times. His charged attack consumes a set amount of stamina to send slashes in an area effect around Ming. His plunge attack allows him to plummet from mid-air and strike the ground around him, dealing AoE damage. His elemental skill, Domain, Ming creates an area of effect that marks enemies inside of it, dealing pyro damage, lasting for 20 seconds. Enemies in the area will continuously take pyro damage. While Ming's domain is active, he gains movement speed increase up to 30% while he's in it. His elemental burst, Ironclad, Ming calls upon the power of Pyro and summons a giant sword made of pure fire that deals AoE pyro damage upon cast. This damage is based off Ming's max defense. While Ironclad is active, Ming is harder to interrupt, he gains a 50% increase in attack speed, and his normal charge and plunge attacks are increased by 320%, dealing pyro damage, and enemies burn for 10 seconds after being struck by Ironclad. Striking the same enemy will refresh the duration of this burn. To give an idea of how much damage this burst does, I ran the math and said the base damage when Ming is built properly is 2060. I then multiplied that by 3, then again by 5 as the total amount of strikes you can do in one combo, and reached 32,960, which, assuming you don't miss an auto attack or have any form of reduction or boost to your damage, is his peak damage performance. I imagined his attack animations to be a lot like Ayaka, where there's 2 periods of multiple strikes counting as one attack. If you cancel the animation of the final strike and go into charged attack, the total attack count reaches 9. This takes his damage, assuming it's all flat damage and the same multiplier, from 32,960 to a whopping 59,328 damage. For his talents, Heart of the Dragon. While Domain is active, if Ming kills an enemy, he regains 10% of his max HP. Light Feet Technique. Ming's movement speed is further increased while Domain is active, up to 50%. Fan the Flames. Pyro damage caused by Ming during Domain is increased by 100%. I originally took the idea of a samurai, a very heavily armored soldier, gave him firepowers, modified Raiden's ultimate with Eula's physical damage idea, because I didn't really know what I was planning. When I first came up with the Domain skill, that changed everything. Connor had asked me to make him be able to teleport like Kaching, which with the Pyro element, I wasn't sure how I was going to be able to achieve that. He also said heavy amounts of movement was okay, so I figured making this heavily armored character who swings heavily and slow and deals large amounts of damage but actually is fast on his feet would make for a very interesting playstyle, especially since his damage is based off of his max defense. For this next character, I created them based off of the person who got me back into streaming. They didn't really say much, so I had to snipe this information from a previous stream of theirs. I won't say who they are, but if they're watching this video, they'll know it's them. Rosette. She's a 5-star cryo polearm, and the region is completely unknown. Her normal attack combos up to 6 times. Her charged attack consumes a set amount of stamina to charge forward, so think like Hu Tao. Plunge attack. She dives from the midair and slams the ground around her, dealing AoE damage. Her elemental skill, Arctic Spear, covers her polearm in an Arctic ice, infusing her attacks with cryo energy. Her normal, charge, and plunge attacks now deal cryo damage. In addition, her normal attacks now hit twice per attack. Her elemental burst, Glacial Reaper, gathers cryo energy around her polearm and forms a frozen blade edge, creating a scythe that deals cryo damage. Her normal, charged, and plunge attacks change as follows. Normal attack now combos up to 8 times. Her charge attack now consumes stamina to launch enemies into the air and slam down on them. If an enemy falls off a high place, they will still take fall damage depending on how far they fall. And you cannot plunge attack while Glacial Reaper is active. For talents, Ice Age, Glacial Reaper now emits a constant field of cryo mist, dealing AoE cryo damage, freezing enemies affected by it after 7 seconds. Fragile, enemies affected by cryo take increased physical damage. Frostbite. Enemies killed by Rosette's normal, charged, or plunged attacks infect nearby enemies with Frostbite. Enemies affected by Frostbite take additional cryo damage. This damage is counted independently of other cryo damages. Making this character, I ran through so many different variations of a cryo polearm, not knowing what to do. My brain was like a dartboard and I was just throwing out ideas left and right, seeing what stuck and what didn't. Right before I gave up on it for the night, the idea of a scythe and a reaper came to mind, as I remembered them saying having someone with this or a scythe as a weapon would be really cool, and they'd like to see that. And honestly, I'm 100% with them. MiHoYo, if you're watching this, give us characters who can throw hands and wield scythes. You made it in Honkai, you can make it over here. Guarantee you that would sell more than Raiden's Shogun did on day 1. Back to the matter at hand. Rosette was all over the place from support to crowd control to sub DPS. Finally, I managed to create a way for Rosette to be sub DPS, but if built correctly could be a main DPS. I hope this person really likes what I did with their very brief side comments on their OC in Genshin. Lastly, I'll be plugging in one of mine. I didn't originally plan to do this, but the person I had asked for an idea never got back to me, and I don't have months and months to wait out for them to send me a message, so I'm substituting it with one of mine, so here you go. A brief bit of background of this character. She's the sister to my personal original character if I was placed inside the world of Teyvat. Akiho the Crimson Fox. She's a Pyro Sword user. She has a passive trait called Crimson Tail, which maxes out at 7, reducing her stamina cost by up to 100% and disappears after a set duration. Her normal attacks can combo up to 7 times, and on her 7th strike in that combo, her damage is increased by 30%. Her charged attacks consume a set amount of stamina to stomp the ground, unleashing a column of flame, a straight line dealing AoE pyro damage to enemies caught in the columns. As stamina is consumed with each tail Akiho has. If Crimson Lotus Searing Flame is active, enemies explode upon contact with the columns. Her elemental skill, Crimson Lotus Searing Flame, ignite your sword and convert all damage done by Akiho's normal charged and plunged attacks to pyro damage and gain 1 tail for each strike. Activate the skill again to end the effect. While the skill is active, each attack drains a portion of Akiho's life. Her elemental burst, Crimson Lotus Hononomichi, erupt in an explosion of flame and dom part of your fox form, dealing AoE pyro damage and igniting your sword, converting all damage to pyro damage. In addition, you are granted the maximum number of tails, and your normal attacks now combo up to 11 strikes for the duration of the effect. The 7th and the 11th strike do an additional 50% and 80% increased damage. Her talents, Longevity, Crimson Tails now last longer, and reduce damage dealt to Akiho by Crimson Lotus Searing Flame. Burning Desire attacks made while Crimson Lotus Searing Flame is active burn enemies longer. Crimson Tails also leave a flaming trail, dealing damage to enemies that come into contact with it. Steeled Resolve, you are harder to knock back and interrupt during Crimson Lotus Hononomichi. In addition, you also take less damage from enemies. When I made this character, I had 2 things on my mind: work and Shadow of Mordor. I always loved some of the combos you could do in that game, even the most basic one of a Wraith Punch into the multi-strike combo, that if you had it leveled up, would cause someone's head to explode and inflict fear to nearby orcs. I saw Akiho's and her siblings all having this series of moves as their base attack. If you need an idea of what this looked like, here's a short clip of that exact combo. Now I know that normal combo is because of the Wraith doing an attack right after yours, mimicking what you do in the final strike isn't really achievable, but let's just say it is, because why not? Her Crimson Tails effect, while not in full detail here, basically takes away stamina issues if used correctly. It also feeds into her whole aesthetic of being like Yai and having box traits. Quick tangent that actually plays really well in D&D. Yes, I'm a nerd who plays D&D on the regular. One of my characters is what's called a Blood Hunter. In short, Blood Hunters imbue elements on command to their weapons in exchange for health. I thought this was the perfect thing for her skill. Lets her turn pyro application on and off at will, but her health continuously ticks down until she either swaps out or turns it off. Her burst basically lets her turn into Asuna from Sword Art Online for a small period, ramping her combo up from 7 hits to 11 to overwhelm and just endlessly wail on enemies in addition to the bonus damage she gets, which I think for someone as ferocious as her is fitting. Her talents I figured were best for slowing down her own destruction, reducing the damage she deals to herself for having her elemental skill active. During her burst, she's harder to knock back, giving a Steeled Resolve as the name implies, and to top it all off, her passion for fighting for what's right is what led me to give her the increased burn time. With that, we've come to the end of the video. Let me know in the comments which character you liked the most. If you found this entertaining and you want a chance to be featured in these kinds of videos, leave a comment below of your character idea. If you join my Discord that's linked in the description, there's a channel dedicated to these ideas and you have a better chance of getting featured that way. Not to mention you join the community where all sorts of things are talked about, not just Genshin. If you leave a like or a comment, it really helps me grow as a channel and as a content creator. I want to thank you all for listening, and I'll see y'all in the next one.